Good afternoon, everybody. I've gone through the stuff that people are murky about, at least about the Howard Zinn article. And some of the biggest ones were about three items. So I'm going to cover these quickly. The My Lai massacre, which took place in Vietnam, um, and then the Dawes Act. And so let me deal with these two together. The My Lai massacre was something that really turned American opinion against the Vietnam War at a point where there still was quite a bit of popular support. In this village in My Lai, American soldiers had been taking fire from in and around the village, and so Lieutenant Calley, and he said Lieutenant Calley was acting on orders, which I believe, um, basically went into the village and pacified it. And Zinn is kind of very fond of using terms like pacification to say what happened. Well, what happened in practice was there was a massacre, and everybody in the village was basically lined up and shot. And it was, in fact, in the case of My Lai, part of the reason the massacre stopped was an American soldier who was a helicopter pilot intervened and put his ship between the villagers and Lieutenant Calley's forces. So and he said, if you don't stop firing, I will open fire on you. That guy later, when they came back to the U.S., Lieutenant Calley was seen as a hero, because he was acting under orders and he was under a tough position. And the other guy, the helicopter pilot, was seen as a bad guy. And he got a lot of heat, and kind of, which, was before social media, so it didn't take place online. Later, Calley now is seen as a kind of bad guy, even though he was acting on orders. He was pardoned later by Richard Nixon, but he was still seen, now he's more seen as the villain in the piece. And the helicopter pilot, whose name I'm sorry I don't remember, was later given like a Medal of Honor, not a Medal of Honor, but I think it's a presidential medal. The Dawes Act is kind of similar in one sense, in that the up until the Dawes Act, Native American tribes who were savages were held their land in common. Held their land in common on these reservations, and Senator Dawes wanted the Indians to learn how the free enterprise system worked, wanted them to kind of be civilized and to kind of join in. And if they didn't have private property, they couldn't do that. And so the Dawes Act split up Indian reservations into private holdings. And so to keep Indians from being dependent on the government, their land sales were used to fund things like schools and food and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The now people got 160 acres, but the reservations were reservations because they were terrible land for farming. So most of the Indians, A, didn't know how to farm, B, even if they had known how to farm, this would have not been sufficient land like in South Dakota. This is not Lancaster County. And then C, most of the Indian reservations were basically stolen and sold off to friends of the guys who were the Indian agents on the land. It's one of the most shameful periods of American history. But this was all done under the guise of civilization and protecting Indians. So in a sense, that both of these incidents come back to the theme of how a stronger power views a weaker power. Do they see them as equal? Do they see them as having an important perspective? And what's the language that we use to describe these things that are going on? Do we basically talk about pacification, or do we talk about massacres? Do we talk about kind of robbery and theft of Indian lands, or do we talk about civilization and uplift?